I told my wife I was flying to Phoenix for a conference, but I never made it to the airport. Instead, I sat in my old pickup truck in a Walmart parking lot, waiting to see what she would do the moment she thought I was gone. What I discovered destroyed my marriage, but it saved my life before I tell you how I brought her world crashing down. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps this old man share his truth. Let me know in the comments. Where you are watching from, my name is Harrison Bennett. I am 70 years old, and I spent 40 years designing skyscrapers in Chicago. I know how to spot a hairline fracture in a foundation long before the building collapses, but I failed to see the cracks in my own home until it was almost too late. It was 5 in the morning, and the Chicago wind was cutting through my coat like a knife. I dragged my rolling suitcase down the driveway, the wheels clicking against the pavement, a sound that echoed in the silence of our suburban street. Catherine stood in the doorway, wrapping her silk robe tight against the chill. She leaned in and pecked me on the cheek. Her lips tasted of mint toothpaste and something else, something that felt disturbingly like relief. Have a safe flight. Harry, she said, her voice soft and practiced. Call me when you land in Phoenix? I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. I will, I said simply. Don't wait up for me on Tuesday. I might be late. She smiled, that tight, polite smile she had perfected over 38 years of marriage. Go on, you will miss your flight, she urged gently, closing the heavy oak door before I had even reached the car. I stood there for a moment in the gray, pre-dawn light, staring at the closed door of the house I had paid. For the house where we raised our daughter Natalie. The house that felt more like a museum than a home these days. I got into my car, but I didn't get into the luxury sedan Catherine insisted we lease for appearances. I climbed into my old Ford pickup, the one I used for gardening and hauling lumber, the one Catherine hated, because she said it made us look low class. I started the engine and drove away. As soon as I turned the corner, I killed the headlights. I didn't head toward O'Hare Airport. I drove 15 miles west to a 24-hour Walmart supercenter. I parked in the furthest corner of the lot, nestled between a rusted van and a shopping cart. Return, knowing my truck wouldn't stand out here. I reclined the seat, pulled a thermos of black coffee from my bag, and prepared to wait. I am a man of precision and patience. Architecture taught me that. You cannot rush a structure, and you cannot rush the truth. You might ask why a 70-year-old man was spying on his wife of nearly 4 decades instead of sitting in a first-class seat to Arizona. The answer was simple, and it was green. It was a notification that had popped up on my iPad. Exactly 1 week ago. I have always been meticulous with finances. I track every penny, not because I'm stingy, but because I believe in order. We share a credit card account for household expenses. Usually it is just grocery bills from Whole Foods or the occasional charge for the country club dues. But last Tuesday, a charge appeared that made my blood run cold, $4,500, at a store called The Gentleman's Boutique in Nashville, Tennessee. I stared at that number for a long time. I do not buy suits in Nashville. I do not buy suits at all anymore since I retired. I live in corduroys and sweaters. When I asked Catherine about it, she didn't even blink. Oh, that she had said casually, waving her hand as if dismissing a fly. That was a mistake. The bank called me about it. Some fraud thing. They are reversing the charge. Don't worry about it. Harry, you stress too much about small numbers. She was smooth, too smooth. She didn't get angry. She didn't get defensive. She just lied with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. But I checked the bank statement again. 2 days later, the charge wasn't reversed. It was paid in full. That was the moment the doubt turned into certainty. I wasn't dealing with a mistake, I was dealing with a pattern. So I invented the architectural conference in Phoenix. I needed to know what she did when I wasn't there. I sat in that truck for 4 hours watching the sun come up over the asphalt, watching shoppers come and go, trying to ignore the ache in my lower back. I ate a cold ham sandwich I had packed myself. Chewing slowly, my eyes glued to the screen of my iPad propped up on the dashboard, I had linked it to the smart home security system, specifically the camera mounted above the garage door. Catherine thought those cameras were just for deterring burglars. She forgot that I was the one who installed them. I was the one who wrote the code for the remote access. At 9:30 in the morning, my tablet buzzed with a notification, motion, detected driveway, garage door opening. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a heavy thudding rhythm that reminded me I wasn't young anymore. I tapped the screen, and the live feed loaded in high definition. The heavy garage door rolled up slowly, revealing the rear of Catherine's pristine silver Lexus. I expected to see her in her usual attire, maybe her yoga pants, or the beige slacks she wore to her charity luncheons. But the woman who stepped out into the garage was someone I barely recognized. She was wearing a dress, a bright crimson-red dress that hugged curves I didn't know. She still flaunted. It was cut low, fast, and expensive. She wore high heels that clicked sharply on the concrete. This was not the Catherine who complained about her bunions. When we walked around the block, this was a woman dressed for a performance. She moved with an energy I hadn't seen in 20 years. She wasn't alone. She was dragging 2 large suitcases, not the carry-on bags we used for weekend trips, but the massive Louis Vuitton trunks she kept wrapped in plastic in the attic. The ones we hadn't used since our trip to Europe 10 years ago. She popped the trunk of the Lexus and heaved the bags inside with surprising strength for a woman who claimed she couldn't lift a bag of potting soil. She walked back to the driver's side, and for a split second, she looked up at the house. She paused, and a smile spread across her face. It wasn't a smile of fondness, it was a smile of victory. It was the smile of an inmate walking out of prison gates. I felt a cold stone settle in my stomach. She wasn't going to the grocery store. She wasn't going to lunch with the girls. She was leaving, and she was taking a lot more than just clothes. I watched on the screen as she backed the car out. The sun glinting off the polished hood. She didn't turn left toward the city center where her friends lived. She turned right toward the interstate on-ramp. I knew exactly where that road led, Interstate 57 South, the road out of Chicago, the road that eventually connected to I-65, the road to Nashville. I put the truck in gear, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned white. I wasn't going to Phoenix, and neither was she. I was going to follow her into whatever secret life she had built on my dime. I waited until she was 2 lights ahead, then I pulled out of the parking lot, merging into traffic. My old truck engine roaring, a stark contrast to the silent luxury of her Lexus. I kept my distance using the skills of observation I had honed over a lifetime of supervising construction sites, watching from the shadows, checking for flaws. She drove fast, faster than she ever drove when I was in the passenger seat. She wove through the morning traffic with aggressive confidence. I stayed 3 cars back, my eyes locked on her license plate. I wasn't Harrison, the retired architect, anymore. I was a man possessing a singular, cold purpose, finding out exactly who my wife really was. She turned onto the highway, speeding away. My instinct screamed at me to chase her down immediately, but the architect in me knew better. I had a GPS tracker on her car. I wouldn't lose her. First, I needed to see what she had left behind. I needed to survey the damage. I sat in the idling truck for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel until the leather creaked. Catherine was gone, speeding toward the interstate, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to slam on the gas and chase her down right then and there. But 40 years of architecture had taught me that you never start a demolition until you have surveyed the site. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. I needed to know the extent of the damage before I confronted the storm. I threw the truck into reverse and backed out of the parking spot, the tires chirping against the asphalt. I drove back toward the house, but I didn't take the leisurely route. I took the shortcuts, the alleyways, the streets I knew better than the city. Planners themselves, I made it back to my driveway in 12 minutes. The house stood there, silent and imposing, a brick-and-mortar lie that I had polished and maintained for decades. I didn't park in the garage. I left the truck running in the driveway, ready. For a quick departure, I unlocked the front door and pushed it open, expecting the silence of an empty home. But what hit me first was not the silence. It was the smell. For 30 years, my house had smelled of lemon polish and the cheap lavender potpourri Catherine insisted on buying in bulk. She said it was soothing. She said it made the house feel like a home. But that smell was gone, replaced by something heavy and cloying. The air was thick with the scent of Chanel No. 5. It was a perfume she never wore around me. She claimed it gave her a headache, claimed it was too expensive and pretentious for a retired teacher, yet here it was hanging in the foyer like a thick fog, suffocating and undeniable. It was the scent of the woman in the red dress. The scent of the stranger who had just walked out of my door. I moved through the hallway, my boots heavy on the hardwood floors. I went straight to the master bedroom. The bed was made perfectly military corners, just the way she always did it. A final act of performance art to prove she was the perfect wife, even as she was leaving. I walked to her closet and threw the doors open. It was a massacre of fabric. The beige cardigans, the sensible slacks, the floral blouses she wore to church were all there, pushing together on the left side of the rack, but the right side, the side where she kept the few nice things I had bought her over the years, was barren. Empty hangers swung back and forth, ghost-like in the draft. From the open door, she hadn't just packed a bag for a trip. She had surgically removed the valuable parts of her wardrobe and left the rest behind like a shed skin. My stomach turned, but I didn't have time to be sick. I turned on my heel and marched down the hall to my study. This was my sanctuary, the one room in the house Catherine rarely entered, because she said the smell of old paper and drafting graphite bored her. I stopped in the doorway and scanned the room. Everything looked normal at a glance. My drafting table was angled toward the window. My books were aligned by height on the shelves, but I have an eye for lines, I have an eye for symmetry, and something was wrong. I looked at the oil painting hanging behind my desk. It was a landscape of the Scottish Highlands, a moody piece I had bought in Edinburgh 20 years ago, to the untrained eye. It looked fine, but to me it was screaming. It was crooked. The bottom right corner was perhaps a quarter of an inch lower than the left. I walked behind the desk, my breath catching in my throat. I reached out and swung the painting away from the wall, revealing the wall safe embedded in the plaster. It was a high-security model, fireproof and heavy, meant to protect the things that mattered most. I reached for the digital keypad, ready to punch in the 6-digit code, a code that was a combination of my mother's birthday and the date I graduated. Architecture school, a code. Catherine swore she could never remember. But I didn't need the code. The heavy steel door wasn't flush with the frame. It was ajar. Just a fraction of an inch. I pulled the handle, and the door swung open smoothly on well-oiled hinges. I stared into the dark metal cavern and felt the blood drain from my face completely. It was empty. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the sharp pain in my old joints, and began to feel around inside the safe frantically, hoping my eyes were deceiving me, hoping that perhaps things had just been pushed to the back. My fingers brushed against cold metal walls and nothing else. The deed to the house, the property I had paid off 15 years ago, was gone. The titles to both vehicles were gone. My passport, the one I had just renewed for a retirement trip we never took, was gone. But then the real blow landed, the one that hurt more than the paper. The bottom shelf of the safe was where I kept my collection. It wasn't just an investment. It was my history. My father had been a watchmaker, a man who appreciated the intricate mechanics of time. He had left me his Patek Philippe, a watch made in 1952 gold casing, with a leather strap that had absorbed the sweat of 2 generations of Bennett men. I had added to the collection. Over the years, a Rolex Submariner I bought when I landed the contract for the Sears Tower renovation. A vintage Omega that Patrice helped me find at an auction. Alongside the Patek, there were 6 watches in total, valued at roughly $80,000. But to me, they were priceless. They were the tangible, ticking proof of my life's work and my family's legacy. The velvet display cases were gone. She hadn't just taken the watches. She had taken the boxes, the certificates of authenticity, the extra links. She had cleaned me out with the efficiency of a professional thief. I sat back on my heels, staring at the empty metal box, feeling a cold rage harden in my chest like concrete setting. This wasn't a midlife crisis. This wasn't a woman running off for a romantic fling because she was bored. This was a calculated liquidation. She hadn't just left me, she was trying to erase me. She wanted the assets, the identity, the history. She wanted to strip the copper wiring out of the walls before she burned the building down. I thought about the notification on my iPad, the $4,000 charge in Nashville. It wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't a one-time indulgence. She was building a war chest. She was financing a new life, and she was doing it with the pieces of my old one. She was moving assets. She was stealing the very ground out from under my feet. I stood up, my knees cracking. The shock was gone, replaced by a cold clarity that terrified me. I wasn't a husband anymore. I was a victim of a long con. And the woman I slept next to for 38 years was the grifter. I grabbed my phone and opened the banking app, my hands shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from adrenaline. I checked the joint savings account. The balance was still there, but there was a pending transfer scheduled for tomorrow. $50,000 moving to an account I didn't recognize. She was smart. She knew large transfers triggered alerts, so she had timed it. She probably thought I was in the air right now, flying to Phoenix, oblivious and unreachable. She thought she had a 5-day head start to drain the accounts and vanish. She was wrong. I wasn't in Phoenix. I was standing in the wreckage of my study, and I was furious. I walked out of the house and didn't bother to lock the door. There was nothing left to steal. The most valuable thing in that house was the truth, and I was taking that with me. I climbed back into my truck and slammed the door. I grabbed my iPad from the passenger seat and pulled up the GPS tracking app. I had installed the tracker on her Lexus a week ago. A small magnetic device tucked inside the rear bumper. Housing a precaution I had felt guilty about at the time, telling myself I was being a paranoid old man. Now that little blinking red dot was the only lifeline I had. The screen refreshed and the map zoomed out. The red dot was moving south, steady and fast. It was already past Kankakee, heading down Interstate 57. She was doing 75 miles an hour, putting distance between herself and the crime scene. She thought she was in the clear. She thought she was driving toward freedom. I tapped the screen, watching the dot move. She was heading toward Nashville, the location of the mysterious boutique, the location of the charge that started this whole unraveling. She wasn't just running away, she was running to something or someone. And I was going to find out exactly what it was. I started the engine, the old Ford roaring to life with a sound that was rough and reliable. I wasn't the architect anymore. I wasn't the provider or the husband. I was a hunter. I backed out of the driveway and pointed the truck south. I had a full tank of gas, a thermos of coffee, and a rage that would fuel me for 1,000 miles. I merged onto the highway, the morning traffic thinning out as I left the city limits behind. The skyline of Chicago faded in, my rearview mirror gray and distant. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, and the digital map on the seat beside me. She had a 2-hour head start, but she didn't know she was being followed. She would stop eventually. She would have to eat. She would have to sleep, and when she did, I would be there watching, waiting, ready to tear down the facade she had built. I pressed the accelerator, the speedometer climbing past 70. The chase was on, and I swore to myself, on the memory of my father's stolen watch, that I wouldn't stop until I had my life back, or until I had burned hers to the ground. 7 hours is a long time for a young man, but for a 70-year-old with a bad lower back, it feels like a sentence in purgatory. I drove south on Interstate 65, watching the landscape change from the flat industrial gray of Illinois to the rolling green hills of Kentucky, and finally into Tennessee. My body was screaming at me. My sciatica was a hot wire running down my right leg, and my eyes felt like they were filled with sand. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The adrenaline coursing through my veins was a more potent fuel than the gasoline in the tank. I ate dry crackers and beef jerky I had found in the glove compartment, washing it down with lukewarm water from a plastic bottle. I kept my eyes darting between the road and the iPad on the passenger seat, watching that little red dot move steadily south like a heartbeat. On a monon, On a monitor, every mile I drove was a mile further away from the life I thought I had, and deeper into a reality I was terrified to confront. By the time I crossed the Tennessee state line, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long golden shadows across the highway. The red dot on my screen finally slowed down and then stopped. It was hovering over a residential area just southwest of downtown Nashville, a place called Belle Meade. I knew of it even from Chicago. It was old money, deep pockets, and mansions hidden behind iron gates. It was the kind of place where people didn't just live, they presided. I exited the highway and navigated through the winding tree-lined streets, my battered Ford truck standing out like a sore thumb among the Rovers and Porsches that glided past me. I felt invisible in the worst way possible, like a servant entering the master's quarters through the back door. I watched the house numbers climb until the GPS indicated I was close. I killed the engine about 2 blocks away, parking on a side street, nestled under the shade of a massive oak tree where a contractor or a gardener might park to avoid drawing attention. I grabbed my binoculars from the center console, a heavy pair of German optics I used for inspecting architectural details on high-rise facades, and stepped out of the truck. My knees popped and my back seized up, but I forced myself upright. I walked down the sidewalk, keeping my head down, trying to look like a man who belonged there, a man who had work to do. I reached the corner and looked down the street there. It was a massive Mediterranean-style villa that looked more like a resort than a home. It had terracotta roof tiles, stucco walls the color of heavy cream, and a circular driveway made of imported cobblestones, and parked right at the front door, gleaming under the porch lights that had just flickered on, was the silver Lexus. I moved quickly, seeking the cover of a line of decorative cedar trees that bordered the property. I wasn't just an old man anymore. I was a ghost haunting my own marriage. I found a gap in the foliage and raised the binoculars, my hands shaking slightly until I braced them against a tree trunk. The lenses brought the front entrance into sharp focus, just as the heavy mahogany doors swung open. Catherine stepped out of the car. She looked radiant in a way that made my chest ache. The fatigue of the drive seemed to have vanished from her. She was glowing. Laughing at something I couldn't hear, she checked her reflection in the side mirror, smoothing her red dress and adjusting her hair. It was a gesture of vanity I hadn't seen in years at home. She barely looked in the mirror before leaving the house. Then the front door of the villa opened, and a man stepped out. My breath caught in my throat. He was younger, much younger, perhaps 45 or 47 years old. He was handsome in a slick, manufactured way, with dark hair styled perfectly, and a tailored suit that cost more than my truck. He didn't look like a husband. He looked like an investment banker or a gigolo. He looked like trouble. He walked down the steps with a confident stride and opened his arms wide. Catherine didn't hesitate. She didn't offer him a cheek or a polite hug. She threw herself into his arms, and he caught her, spinning her slightly. He pulled her close, his hands sliding down to her waist with a familiarity that made bile rise in my throat. He kissed her, not a peck, but a deep, lingering kiss right there on the doorstep. I lowered the binoculars, feeling like I had been punched in the gut. This wasn't just a fling. This wasn't a mistake. This was an established relationship. They moved together like magnets, locking into place. I watched as he pulled back and said something to her, brushing a stray hair from her face. His expression was possessive, adoring, and predatory. All at once, I needed to hear them. Seeing wasn't enough anymore. I needed the words to confirm the nightmare. I checked the street. It was empty. Dusk was settling rapidly, providing me with shadows. I crept forward, moving along the perimeter of the property, using the landscaping as cover. I had spent 40 years on construction sites, climbing scaffolding and navigating hazards. I knew how to move without being seen in with my aching joints. I made it to a large rhododendron bush just 10 yards from where they stood. The air here was heavy with the scent of jasmine and that cloying Chanel perfume she was wearing. I held my breath, straining my ears against the hum of distant traffic and the chirping of crickets. "Welcome home, baby," the man said, his voice smooth like expensive whiskey. "I missed you." Catherine giggled, a sound that was girlish and completely foreign to me. "I missed you too, Lorenzo. The drive was awful. I hate driving that car. It feels so pedestrian compared to the Bentley." Lorenzo laughed a low, throaty sound. "Don't worry about it. We will get rid of it soon enough. Come inside. I have your favorite champagne on ice, and I told the chef to prepare the sea bass just the way you like it." He paused and looked at her with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "And did you bring it?" "Is everything safe?" Catherine nodded. Her face serious for a moment. "Yes," she said, her voice dropping lower but still audible in the crisp evening air. "The safe is empty. I took the deeds, the passports, and the collection. It is all in the trunk." The old man didn't suspect a thing. Lorenzo smiled, a wolfish grin that showed too many teeth. "Good girl," he said, kissing her forehead. "And he is gone. He is out of the picture." Catherine let out a sigh of relief, leaning her head against his shoulder. "He is gone. Lorenzo, he thinks he is in Phoenix right now, attending some boring conference about steel beams and glass loads. He is probably sitting in a hotel room reading a book. The old fool is so predictable, it is pathetic." I gripped the branch of the bush so hard, the bark bit into my palm. She was mocking me, mocking the life we built, mocking the very stability she had exploited for decades. "Come on," Veronica, Lorenzo said, and the name hit me like a physical blow. Veronica, who is Veronica, my wife's name, was Catherine Elizabeth Bennett, but she answered to it instantly, as if she had been wearing that name for years. "Coming," she said softly, looking up at him with adoration. "Baby, the old man is gone. I made sure of it. You brought everything here. We have 5 whole days before I have to play the grieving wife. Let's not waste them." They turned and walked arm in arm toward the massive front doors, leaving the Lexus with my life's savings in the trunk, unattended in the driveway. I stayed crouched in the dirt as the heavy doors closed, shutting out the world, shutting me out completely. My heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm of devastation. It wasn't just adultery. She wasn't just sleeping with him. She had created an entirely new persona. Veronica Vance lived in a mansion in Nashville. She drank champagne and wore red dresses and dated younger men, while Catherine Bennett lived in Chicago and made meatloaf and complained about the heating bill. She was living 2 lives, and she had just funded this one by liquidating mine. I looked at the closed door and realized with a terrifying clarity that the woman I had married didn't exist. She was a character, a role played by a master actress, and the curtain had just come down. I slowly backed away from the house, retreating into the shadows. I made my way back to the truck, my legs feeling heavy as lead, but my mind was sharpening. The shock was fading, replaced by the cold, hard logic of an architect staring at a structural failure. She thought I was a predictable old fool. She thought I was reading a book in Phoenix. She was wrong. I was right here, and I had just seen the blueprints of her destruction. I climbed into my truck and started the engine, the vibration of the steering wheel grounding me. She wanted to be Veronica. Fine, I would treat her like Veronica. And Veronica was about to find out that the old man knew how to bring down the house. I stayed in the darkness of the garden for hours, as the sun completely surrendered to the night, and the air turned crisp and cool. The silence of the affluent neighborhood was broken by the sound of tires crunching on gravel, as car after car arrived at the villa, turning the quiet driveway into a parade of wealth and excess. I watched from behind the thick foliage of a laurel hedge, my knees pressed into the damp mulch, my hands stained with dirt, looking like a common thief in my own life. I was wearing my old gardening clothes, a faded flannel shirt and canvas pants stained with oil and soil from years of working in my yard back in Chicago. I looked down at my hands, rough and calloused from decades of handling blueprints and building materials, and then I looked up at the golden light spilling from the massive French doors of the villa. The contrast was so sharp, it felt like a physical blow. I was the man who had built the foundation of this wealth, but here I was hiding in the bushes while strangers enjoyed the fruits of my labor. The guests were a mix of Nashville elite and flashy new money men in bespoke suits, and women dripping in diamonds. They moved through the house with the ease of people who had never worried about a mortgage payment or a grocery bill. Adjusted my position, ignoring the stiffness in my joints, and raised the binoculars again. The living room of the villa was like a stage set, lit by crystal chandeliers that cast a warm glow over the scene. Then she appeared. Catherine, or Veronica, as she was called here. She glided into the room and the crowd seemed to part for her. She had changed again, this time into a shimmering silver evening gown that caught the light. With every movement, she looked regal, she looked powerful, she looked nothing like the woman who sat across from me at the breakfast table eating dry toast and complaining about her arthritis. She was holding a bottle of wine, cradling it like a newborn baby. Even from this distance, I recognized the label. The dark glass, the specific curve of the neck, my breath hitched in my chest. It was a bottle of 1990 Chateau Margaux. I had bought that bottle 20 years ago at an auction, intending to open it on our 40th wedding anniversary. It was the crown jewel of my small collection, kept in the climate-controlled dark of my cellar, waiting for a celebration that would never happen. I watched as she handed the bottle to a waiter who uncorked it. With practiced ease, she didn't even flinch as he poured the dark ruby liquid into crystal glasses. She took a glass and raised it high, her face flushed with excitement and triumph. I could hear her voice drifting out through the open terrace doors, clear and confident. To new beginnings, she announced, her voice ringing out like a bell, and to smart investments. Thank you all for trusting Lorenzo and me with your future. The fund we have launched is performing beyond expectations, and tonight, we celebrate the freedom that wealth brings to the Veronica Vance Global Initiative. The guests cheered, raising their glasses in a toast. They drank my wine, my anniversary wine, swallowing $300 a sip, without knowing that the man who paid for it was watching them from the dirt 10 yards away. I felt a burning sensation in my stomach, a mixture of bile and pure, unadulterated rage. She wasn't just stealing my money, she was stealing my memories. She was taking the symbols of our life together and using them as props in her con game. Then Lorenzo stepped forward. He stood next to her, sliding his arm around her waist, with that same possessive familiarity I had seen earlier. He looked every inch the successful partner, handsome, smooth, and utterly hollow. He raised his hand to silence the room, smiling that wolfish grin. I want to propose a toast to my beautiful fiancée, he said, and the word fiancée hit me harder than a fist. She wasn't just playing a role, she was planning a future that required me to be dead and buried, at least on paper, to the woman who makes everything possible, to Veronica. He raised his glass, and as he did, the light from the chandelier caught something on his wrist, a flash of gold that was unmistakable. I focused the binoculars, my hands trembling so hard I had to rest them on a branch to steady the image. It was a watch, a gold watch with a leather strap and a distinct cream-colored face. I knew that watch better than I knew the lines on my own palm. It was a Patek Philippe Calatrava vintage 1952. It was my grandfather's watch, the watch my father had worn every day of his life until he passed it down to me on my graduation day. I remembered the weight of it, the sound of its ticking, the way my father had taught me to wind it gently, never forcing the crown. It wasn't just a timepiece, it was the heartbeat of the Bennett family history. I had kept it in the safe, only taking it out for weddings and funerals, terrified of scratching it or losing it. And now it was dangling from the wrist of a gigolo in Nashville, Tennessee. He wore it casually, loosely, as if it were a trinket he had picked up at a duty-free shop. He didn't know the history. He didn't know the sweat and the tears that had gone into earning that watch. He only knew it looked expensive. "Look at this," he said, loudly tapping the face of the watch with his fingernail. A sound that made me wince, a gift from my love. "She has impeccable taste, doesn't she?" Catherine beamed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Only the best for you, my love," she cooed. "The best." I lowered the binoculars and sat back on my heels, fighting the urge to vomit. The humiliation was absolute. It wasn't just that she had taken the watch. It was the casual cruelty of it. She had given my family legacy to her lover as a party favor. She had taken the symbol of my father's hard work and used it to decorate the man she was sleeping with. I looked down at my own wrist at the cheap digital watch I wore for gardening, the one with the rubber strap that cost $19. The irony was suffocating. I was the one who had worked 70-hour weeks for 40 years. I was the one who had climbed scaffolding in freezing winds and sweltering heat to inspect steel beams. I was the one who had saved every penny, denied myself luxuries, and built a fortress of security for my family. And here I was hiding in the mud, while a man who had likely never done a day of honest work in his life drank my wine and wore my inheritance. I realized then with a clarity that cut through the emotion that I wasn't just a victim of infidelity. I was the financier of this entire charade, every dollar on that table, every thread of clothing on their backs. The gas in the tank of the Lexus, the champagne in their glasses. It was all me. I was sponsoring my own destruction. I was paying for the knife they were using to stab me in the back. I looked at the house again, seeing it not as a home but as a parasite. It was feeding on me, draining my lifeblood to sustain its glitter and its noise. Catherine, or Veronica, or whatever she called herself now, was a vampire she hadn't just stopped loving. She had decided that I was nothing more than a resource, a vein to be tapped until it ran dry. The laughter from the party grew louder, a crescendo of joy that felt obscene. In the face of my devastation, I wanted to storm in there. I wanted to smash the glass doors and scream the truth until their ears bled. I wanted to rip that watch off Lorenzo's wrist and expose them for the frauds they were. But I stopped myself. I forced my breathing to slow. I forced my hands to unclench. Storming in now would only get me arrested. They would call the police. They would claim I was a stalker or a crazy old man. And with the paperwork she had likely forged, they might even have the legal standing to have me committed. No. I couldn't react with emotion. I had to react with intellect. I was an architect, and when a building is rotten, you don't kick the walls. You find the load-bearing pillars, and you place the explosives exactly where they need to be to bring the whole thing down in one controlled implosion. I watched them for a few minutes longer, memorizing their faces, memorizing the layout of the room, memorizing the arrogance in their posture. I needed to hate them. I needed to let this humiliation burn away any lingering affection or hesitation I had once felt for my wife. I looked at Catherine one last time. She was laughing, head thrown back, exposing her throat. She looked happy, she looked free, and she looked completely devoid of conscience. She had erased me, and she was celebrating it. I slowly retreated back into the shadows, moving carefully so as not to alert them. I had seen enough. I knew what I was dealing with. Now, I wasn't dealing with a wife who had made a mistake. I was dealing with a monster who had been wearing a mask for 38 years. As I reached the edge of the property, ready to make my way back to the truck, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It wasn't the laughter of the party. It was the sharp electronic trill of a cell phone ringing. It was coming from the terrace. Catherine excused herself from the group, holding her phone up and walking toward the edge of the balcony right above where I had been hiding. Just moments ago, I crouched down again, pressing myself into the dirt. The phone call could be nothing, or it could be the next piece of the puzzle I needed. I strained my ears, waiting to hear who she was talking to in the middle of her victory party. And when she spoke, the name she uttered turned my blood to ice, because it wasn't a friend, and it wasn't a business associate. It was the one person I thought would never betray me. I crouched in the damp mulch beneath the limestone balcony, my knees screaming in protest. But I didn't dare move a muscle above me. The click of high heels on stone stopped, and the heavy scent of her perfume drifted down, settling over me like a poisonous fog. She was right there, leaning against the railing. Not 10 feet above my head, I could hear the rustle of her silk dress. I could hear her intake of breath before she answered the phone. "Hello, Natalie," she said, and the warmth in her voice was sickeningly familiar. It was the same tone she used when she was pretending to be the doting mother, the same tone she Used to ask me for money to cover Natalie's credit card bills I always paid without question. I froze my hand, hovering over the pocket of my flannel shirt, where my phone lay, silence stretched for a moment, as she listened to whatever my daughter was saying. On the other end, then, Catherine laughed, a low, dismissive sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Stop worrying, sweetie," she cooed, looking out over the dark garden, oblivious to the fact that the man she was destroying was huddled in the shadows beneath her feet. "Your father is fine. Well, he is fine for now. He is in Phoenix, chasing his little architectural dreams. He has no idea what is happening here." I pulled my phone out, slowly pressing the side button to wake the screen. Without looking at it, I swiped up and tapped the red circle of the voice recorder app. The timer started counting seconds, silently capturing the evidence that would sever the last tether. I had to humanity, "But Mom, are you sure the doctor signed it?" I heard Natalie's voice, tinny and faint, leaking from the speaker of Catherine's phone. The sound of my daughter's voice hit me harder than the sight of my wife in another man's arms. Natalie was my little girl, the one I had carried on my shoulders at parades, the one whose student loans I had paid off in full, the one whose down payment for her first house had come from my bonus check. "Yes, the certificate is done," Catherine replied, her voice turning hard and businesslike. Dr. Evans was very cooperative after a generous donation to his private practice fund. According to the paperwork, Harrison is suffering from early-onset dementia. With episodes of aggression, he is a danger to himself and others. He is legally incapacitated. Natalie. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. Incapacitated aggression. I was the most disciplined man they knew. I had never raised a hand to anyone in my life, but they were rewriting my history. They were painting me as a senile monster to justify locking me away. "So what happens when he lands on Tuesday?" Natalie asked, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no guilt, no sadness, just a cold impatience that mirrored her mother's. "Perfectly. That is the easy part," Catherine said, swirling the wine in her glass. "Pick him up from the airport. Just like a good daughter, tell him there is a surprise, tell him anything you want, but do not bring him back to the house. Drive him straight to Sunny Meadows. The intake team is expecting him at 4 o'clock. Sunny Meadows, I knew the place. It was a high-end storage facility for the unwanted elderly, a place with locked doors and heavy sedation where troublesome relatives were parked until they stopped breathing. "But what if he resists?" Natalie asked. "He won't." Catherine assured her, "He trusts you. That is his weakness. He thinks the sun rises and sets on you. He will get in the car, and by the time he realizes where he is going, the orderlies will be there to sedate him once he is inside the temporary conservatorship. Kicks in, and we have a control of everything. The accounts, the properties, the remaining assets. It is over. Natalie, we won." We won. Those two words echoed in the darkness, tearing through me like shrapnel. My daughter wasn't being coerced. She wasn't a reluctant accomplice. She was a partner. She was playing the long game just like her mother. "Okay, Mom," Natalie said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Enjoy your party. Tell Lorenzo I said hello, and don't worry about Dad. I will handle the package on Tuesday." The package, she called me the package. I was no longer her father. I was simply a logistical problem, to be transported and stored. Catherine hung up the phone and stood there for a moment longer. Finishing her stolen wine, she hummed a little tune, a happy melody I recognized from our honeymoon 40 years ago. Then, she turned and walked back into the party, the glass doors sliding shut behind her, muting the laughter and the music. I remained in the dirt, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. The recording was still running, capturing the sound of my own ragged breathing. I stopped the recording and saved the file, naming it simply "The End." I didn't cry. I thought I would. I thought the betrayal of my only child would break me. But as I stood up, brushing the soil from my knees, I felt something else entirely. The grief had burned away, leaving behind a cold, barren landscape of absolute clarity. I was an architect, and I knew that when a building's foundation is compromised, when the rot has spread to the structural beams, you don't try to patch it. You don't try to save the paint or the fixtures. You condemn it. You fence it off, and you bring in the wrecking ball that Taylin was the one person I would have died for. I had spent my life building a shelter for her, protecting her from the harshness of the world. I had given her everything, expecting nothing in return but love and respect. Instead, she had sold me out for a share of the inheritance. She had agreed to lock her own father in a cage to get her hands on my money sooner. My hands were shaking, but not from sadness. They were shaking with the vibrations of a machine shifting gears. I looked at my hands in the moonlight, the hands that had drawn blueprints for skyscrapers that withstood gale force winds. They were strong hands, capable hands, and they were done building for these people. I turned away from the villa and began the long walk back to my truck. I moved with a new purpose. The heaviness in my step was gone, replaced by a predatory silence. They wanted to declare me incompetent. They wanted to say I was losing my mind. Fine. I would show them exactly how sharp my mind still was. I reached the truck and climbed inside, the familiar smell of old leather and gasoline grounding me. I looked at the dark house one last time, at the windows glowing with the party. I wasn't invited to the party that was celebrating my demise. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, leaving no lights on until I was a mile away. I wasn't going to the police, not yet. The police would take reports. They would file paperwork. They would move at the speed of bureaucracy, and Catherine and Natalie would have time to spin their story, to hide the assets, to play the victims. No, this required a different kind of justice, a structural justice. I needed to cut off the supply lines. I needed to isolate the variables, and I needed to execute a controlled demolition that would bring their entire world down while I stood safely outside the blast zone. I picked up my phone and dialed a number from memory. It was late, but I knew she would be awake. Rebecca Weiss was the only lawyer I trusted. A woman who had been my friend since college. A woman Catherine hated because Rebecca was too smart, too sharp, and too loyal to me. Rebecca answered on the second ring, her voice raspy with sleep, but alert. Harrison. Is everything okay? You never call this late. I need you to open a file. Rebecca, I said, my voice steady and cold as a winter draft. What kind of file? Harrison. A war file. I replied, turning onto the main road and pressing the accelerator, heading north toward the only battlefield that mattered. No. I am coming home, Rebecca, and I need you to find every loophole, every clause, and every hidden trapdoor in my estate, planning because I am about to rewrite history. What happened, Harrison? She asked, sensing the shift in my tone. I died tonight. Rebecca, I said, watching the city limits of Nashville fade behind me. Harrison, the husband, and Harrison, the father, died tonight. The man coming back to Chicago is someone else entirely, and he is coming to collect a debt. I drove into the darkness, the recording of my daughter's betrayal burning a hole in my pocket, fueling the engine of my revenge. The drive back would be long, but I wasn't tired. I was wide awake for the first time in 30 years, and I had a lot of work to do before Tuesday. The drive back to Chicago was a blur of asphalt and headlights. A 7-hour funeral procession for the life I had built. I drove through the night, fueled by the bitter coffee I bought at a gas station in Kentucky, and the cold, burning rage that had settled in my chest. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't want distractions. I needed to think, to plan, to construct a defense against the demolition crew that was my own family. I watched the sun rise over the Chicago skyline, the steel and glass towers turning gold in the morning light buildings. I had helped design structures that would outlast me and my petty tragedies. The city looked the same, but I was a stranger in it now. A man without a home, without a wife, and, as I was about to find out, without an identity. I didn't drive to the house in the suburbs. That house was a trap, a stage set for my abduction. Instead, I drove straight to the Loop, navigating the morning rush hour with the mechanical precision of a robot. I parked my truck in a public garage 3 blocks from the building where Rebecca Weiss had her offices. I checked my wallet before I got out. I had $212 in cash. That was it, $200 to my name in a city where a parking spot cost $40. I walked the 3 blocks with my collar turned up against the wind, Feeling exposed and vulnerable for the first time in 50 years, Rebecca was already there when I arrived at 8 o'clock. She was a woman of 65, sharp as a tack, with gray hair cut in a severe bob and eyes that didn't miss a thing. She had been my lawyer and my friend since we were undergraduates. She was the one person Catherine had never been able to isolate me from, mostly because Rebecca refused to be pushed aside. "Harrison," she said. When I walked into her office, her voice losing its usual professional detachment. "You look like hell. I feel like a ghost, Rebecca," I said, sinking into the leather chair opposite her desk. "I need you to look something up for me. I need to know if I still exist." She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer platitudes. She just turned to her computer and started typing. I gave her the details, the names, the dates, the conversation. I had recorded in the garden in Nashville. I played the audio for her, and I watched her face turn from concern to stone-cold fury. "That is a conspiracy," she whispered, the word hanging in the air like smoke. "Check the court records," I said. My voice flat. "Check the probate court filings for Cook County. Look for a petition regarding my mental health." She typed furiously, her eyes scanning the screen rapidly. Silence filled the room. A heavy, suffocating silence that was broken only by the click of her mouse and the hum of the hard drive. Then she stopped, her hands hovering over the keyboard. She looked up at me, and her expression was one of genuine horror. "Harrison," she said softly, "they didn't wait for Tuesday. They filed yesterday afternoon. Read it to me," I commanded. She took a deep breath, adjusting her glasses. Ex parte. Petition for emergency conservatorship. Petitioner Catherine Bennett, supported by affidavit from Dr. Anthony Evans, attending physician subject. Harrison Bennett. Diagnosis: advanced Alzheimer's disease, with rapid onset paranoia and episodes of domestic aggression. Subject poses an immediate threat to himself and others. Aggression. I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. "I have never raised my hand to anyone, Rebecca. You know that I know that," she said, her voice tight. "But the court doesn't know that the court sees a sworn affidavit from a licensed physician and a petition from a concerned wife claiming she is terrified for her husband's safety." The judge granted the temporary order pending a hearing. "Harrison, legally speaking, you have been declared incompetent. And the assets I asked already, knowing the answer, but needing to hear it," said aloud. Rebecca switched windows on her screen, logging into the banking portal, where she had viewing privileges as my estate attorney. She stared at the screen for a long moment, and then she turned the monitor so I could see it for myself. Account status: frozen court order. Every account, the joint, checking the savings, the investment portfolio. Even my personal retirement accounts. Everything was locked. Beside each balance was a little red padlock icon, a digital symbol that meant I was no longer the master of my own fortune. "They moved fast," Rebecca said, scanning the transaction history, "before the freeze locked everything down. There were 3 massive transfers yesterday, totaling $2.4 million, moved to a trust account in Nevada under the name VV Holdings. Veronica Vance," I said, the name tasting bitter on my tongue. "She didn't just freeze my assets. She liquidated what she could and moved it out of state." I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the busy street below. People were rushing to work, buying coffee, laughing, talking on their phones. They were living their lives, oblivious to the fact that a man could be erased with a few pieces of paper and a lie. "I am a millionaire," I said, my voice quiet but intense. "I have a net worth of over $8 million. I own property, I own stocks, I have a pension, and right now I cannot buy a sandwich. I cannot put gas in my truck. I am a pauper. Rebecca, I am a beggar in a suit. And it is worse than that," she added, walking over to stand beside me. "If you try to access your money, the bank will call the police if you go home. Catherine can call the police and show them the court order stating you are a danger to yourself. They will take you into custody and hand you over to the guardians she has appointed, which means they will take you straight to Sunny Meadows. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. It was a perfect trap, a cage built of laws and lies, and I was already inside it. I had thought I was the hunter chasing her to Nashville, but she had been the spider weaving this web for months, maybe years. So what do we do? I asked, turning to look at her. We fight, we go. To the judge, we show him the recording. We prove I am sane. Rebecca shook her head slowly, her eyes full of a sad, pragmatic wisdom. Harrison listened to me carefully. If we walk into that courtroom today, you are an agitated, exhausted man who has been driving all night. You are dirty, you are unshaven, and you are furious. You fit the description in the doctor's affidavit perfectly. Catherine will say the recording is a fabrication, or that it is proof of your paranoia, spying on your family. She has a doctor's signature. She has your daughter's testimony, saying she is scared of you right now. She holds the handle of the knife. If we grab the blade, we will only bleed. I slammed my hand against the window frame, the glass rattling. Damn it, Rebecca, so I just let them win. I let them lock me away, she said, her voice sharp and commanding. We do not let them win, but we cannot fight them head on, not when they control the battlefield. We have to change the terrain. She walked back to her desk and pulled a thick, dusty file from the bottom drawer. It was an old file, the cardboard edges frayed, marked with the year 1998. Do you remember this? She asked, tapping the file. I looked at it, frowning. 1998 was the year I started my own firm, the year I began making real money. The Bennett Family Trust. I said, yes, she said, opening the file, but do you remember the specific clauses we wrote into the bylaws of the LLC that holds your real estate and your primary investment accounts? Catherine never read this. She just signed where you told her to sign because she found legal jargon boring. I tried to remember back then. I was obsessed with protecting my work, protecting my legacy from liability suits in the construction industry. We created a poison pill. Memory surfacing through the fog of my exhaustion. Exactly, Rebecca said, a smile finally touching her lips. Clause 19, Section 4. In the event that any managing member is declared incompetent or incapacitated, control of the assets does not transfer to the next of kin or the secondary beneficiary. Instead, the assets are automatically placed into a blind trust managed by an independent third-party auditor for a mandatory period of 6 months to ensure no financial malfeasance occurred prior to the incapacitation. I looked at her, the gears in my mind finally catching, turning, meshing together, so if I am declared incompetent. I asked, my voice steadying. Then Catherine loses control too, Rebecca finished. If she uses that court order to try and sell the house or access the LLC accounts, she triggers the audit. The bank freezes her out just as hard as they froze you out, and an independent forensic accountant begins combing through every transaction for the last 5 years, which means they will find the embezzlement. I said, they will find the transfers to Nevada. Exactly, Rebecca said, leaning back in her chair, but for this to work, Harrison, the order has to stand. You have to be incompetent, at least for a few days. You have to let them think they have won. You have to walk into the trap willingly. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had built skyscrapers, the hands that were now shaking with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She was right. I couldn't fight the diagnosis from the outside. I had to go inside. I had to become the Trojan horse. I have $200. I said, checking my wallet again, and a truck full of gardening tools. Rebecca opened her purse and pulled out a stack of cash, handing it to me. Here is $2,000. Go buy a burner phone. One of those old Nokias that looks like a brick. Hide it on you somewhere. They won't look. Get a hotel room. Pay cash, sleep for 12 hours, shower. Eat, and then call your daughter. You want me to surrender? I asked, taking the money. I want you to initiate the demolition, she corrected me. Catherine thinks you are a crumbling building. Harrison, show her that you are actually a bomb. I nodded, putting the money in my pocket. I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The panic was gone, replaced by the cold, hard focus of a man with a blueprint. I will call Natalie tomorrow, I said. walking to the door. "And Harrison," Rebecca called out, stopping me. "One last time when you go into that facility, when they shut the door behind you. Remember one thing. What is that? You are the architect. You know where the exits are." I walked out of her office and back into the cold. Chicago morning. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was an undercover operative in my own life. I had died on paper. My identity stripped away by a judge I had never met. But the man walking down the street wasn't dead. He was just waiting for the right moment to light the fuse. I spent the day in a cheap motel near the airport preparing myself. I bought the burner phone and taped it inside the sole of my orthopedic shoe, knowing they would check my pockets, but would never touch an old man's shoes. I practiced my tremor. I practiced the confused, vacant stare I had seen in my own father before he passed. I was ready to die on paper, so I could bury them in reality tomorrow. I would call Natalie tomorrow, I would let them take me, and tomorrow the real game would begin. I sat on the edge of the cheap motel mattress, staring at the Nokia phone in my hand. It felt heavy like a detonator waiting to be pressed. The morning light was filtering through the thin curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. And I knew it was time to start the performance of a lifetime. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump, letting my jaw go slack, and I dialed my daughter's number. Natalie answered on the second ring, her voice impatient as if I were a telemarketer, interrupting her morning coffee. "Hello?" I let a moment of silence hang between us, breathing raggedly into the receiver. "Nat," I said, pitching my voice a octave higher, injecting a tremor of panic that felt humiliatingly real. "Nat, is that you? I do not know where I am. The street signs look wrong, and I think I lost my wallet." There was no gasp of concern on the other end. There was no "Daddy, stay calm, tell me what you see." There was only a sharp intake of breath followed by the cold click of her tongue. Against her teeth, the sound of someone calculating a logistical nuisance. "Where are you exactly?" she asked, her voice flat and devoid of warmth. "Just read the sign across the street." "Dad, focus." "I am near the airport." "I think," I stammered, sticking to the script. Rebecca and I had rehearsed. I wanted to buy a ticket to Phoenix, but they said I had no money. "Nat, I am scared. The people are looking at me funny." "Stay right there," she commanded, the authority in her voice chilling me to the bone. "Do not move, do not talk to anyone, and for God's sake, do not try to drive. I am tracking your phone. I will be there in 20 minutes. She hung up without saying goodbye, without saying, "I love you," without offering a single crumb of comfort. I stared at the disconnect screen, feeling a final crack in my heart. My daughter, my little girl, wasn't worried about her father wandering, confused in the city. She was worried the package had gotten loose before she could secure it. I went into the bathroom and splashed cold water. On my face, I looked in the mirror and didn't shave. The stubble on my chin was gray and patchy, making me look older, more neglected. Ruffled my hair, messing up the part I had maintained meticulously for decades. I put on my coat, buttoning it wrong, skipping a loop on purpose. Then I sat on the curb outside the motel and waited. 20 minutes later, the black Audi Q7 I had bought her for her 30th birthday pulled up to the curb. She didn't even park properly. She just idled in the fire lane and rolled down the window. "Get in," she said, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. I shuffled toward the car, moving with the hesitant gait of the infirm. I opened the door and climbed in, the smell of new leather and her expensive perfume filling the cabin. She didn't lean over to hug me, she didn't check me for injuries, she just hit the door lock button, a sound that echoed with finality. "Buckle up," she said, putting the car in gear and peeling away from the curb before I had even settled. "Nat, where is your mother?" I asked, keeping my voice quavering. "She said she was going to the store." "But that was days ago. Mom is waiting for us," she said, staring straight ahead, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "She is very worried about you, Dad. You have been acting very strange lately." I watched the city roll by through the tinted windows. We were heading north, away from our neighborhood, away from the home I built. We were heading toward the affluent suburbs where the estates were set back from the road, behind high walls and security gates. I knew exactly where we were going. I had seen the brochures on Catherine's desk months ago, disguised under a pile of gardening magazines. Sunny Meadows. It sounded like a summer camp. But I knew what it was. It was a warehouse for the inconvenient elderly, a place where wealthy families paid $6,000 a month to assuage their guilt while forgetting their parents existed. We drove for 40 minutes in silence. Natalie turned on the radio, drowning out any attempt at conversation. She was texting with one hand, while driving, a habit I used to scold her for. But now I just watched, feeling a detached curiosity. She was probably texting Catherine, telling her the asset was secured. The car slowed down as we approached a massive wrought iron gate flanked by stone pillars. A sign in tasteful gold lettering read, Sunny Meadows, Assisted Living and Memory Care. The gate opened silently, scanning a transponder on Natalie's windshield. We glided up a long, winding driveway lined with manicured hedges and weeping willows. It was beautiful on the surface, designed to look like a country club. But I looked at the windows on the upper floors. They only opened 3 inches, safety stops to prevent jumpers. Natalie stopped the car under the portico of the main building, a grand structure that mimicked a Georgian manor. 2 men in white polo shirts and khaki pants were waiting by the entrance. They looked like orderlies, but they moved like bouncers. "We are here," Natalie said, turning off the engine. She finally looked at me, taking off her sunglasses. Her eyes were dry, hard stones. "Come on, Dad, let's get you cleaned up." I let them help me out of the car, acting confused, looking around with wide, frightened eyes. And then I saw her. Catherine was standing in the lobby behind the glass doors. She wasn't wearing the red dress from Nashville. She was wearing a beige cardigan and sensible shoes, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. She looked like the perfect grieving wife. As soon as I walked through the doors, she rushed forward, her face crumpling into a mask of anguish. "Harrison," she cried, throwing her arms around me. "You had us so worried. Where have you been?" I stiffened in her embrace, smelling the faint, lingering trace of Chanel No. 5 beneath the lavender detergent. She was playing her part perfectly for the audience of nurses and administrators standing nearby. I missed my flight. "Catherine," I whispered, "playing my part?" In return, I do not know what happened. The time just went away. She pulled back, cupping my face in her hands, her eyes scanning mine, not with love, but searching for a sign that I knew the truth. She saw only the vacant stare I offered her. "It is okay, Harry," she soothed, patting my cheek. "We are going to get you help. This is Dr. Evans. He is going to take good care of you." A tall man with a clipboard stepped forward, smiling, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Bennett, welcome to Sunny Meadows. We just want to get you settled in, make sure you are hydrated and safe." I let them lead me down a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and lilies. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, but every door we passed had a keypad lock. This wasn't a hospital, it was a prison with nice wallpaper. We reached a room at the end of the hall. It was spacious with a view of the gardens, but I noticed immediately that the furniture was bolted to the floor and there were no sharp edges anywhere. "We need to take your personal effects, Mr. Bennett, just for safekeeping," the doctor said, gesturing to one of the orderlies. I handed over my wallet, my belt, and my jacket. The orderly patted down my pockets, checking for anything. Contraband. I held my breath as his hands moved down my legs toward my shoes. Rebecca had told me to tape the burner phone inside the sole of my orthopedic shoe. Beneath the insert, it was a gamble, a massive risk if they found it. The game was over before it began. The orderly checked my socks. He checked my ankles, but he didn't ask me to take off my shoes. He stood up and nodded to the doctor. "He is clean." Catherine stood in the doorway, watching the process with a look of immense satisfaction. She thought she had won. She thought the chess match was over, and she was looking at the board, clearing away the last piece. "You rest now." "Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with fake syrup, "Natalie and I will handle the paperwork. We will come back to check on you later." Natalie stood behind her, looking at her phone board, detached, ready to leave. "Do not leave me here," I pleaded, grabbing Catherine's hand one last time. Acting the terrified old man. "Please, Kate, let's go home." She pulled her hand away, gently but firmly. "This is your home now, Harry," she said, and there was a flash of steel in her eyes, a glimpse of the woman in the red dress, just for a second. "It is for your own good." They walked out, and the heavy door clicked shut behind them. I heard the electronic beep of the lock engaging. I stood in the middle of the room listening to their footsteps fading down the hall. I waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes, until the silence was absolute. Then I walked to the window and looked out. I could see them walking toward the parking lot, Catherine and Natalie walking side by side, talking animatedly. Catherine laughed a sound of pure victory, and Natalie high-fived her mother. I turned away from the window and sat on the bed. I reached down and untied my left shoe, pulling out the foam insert underneath, nestled in a hollow I had carved out. Myself was the tiny black phone. I pressed the power button, and the screen glowed to life with a full battery signal. I wasn't trapped. I was exactly where I needed to be. I was the virus in their system, and the infection was about to spread. I sat back against the pillows. The ghost of a smile touching my lips for the first time in days. They had locked the door to keep me in, but they didn't realize they had just locked themselves out of their own fortune. The Trojan horse was inside the walls, and night was falling fast. 72 hours is a lifetime when you are living in a beige box waiting for your executioners to arrive. The room at Sunny Meadows was nice enough in a sterile, lifeless sort of way. It had floral curtains that were bolted to the wall, and a television that only played 3 channels of wholesome content. But I knew what it really was. It was a holding cell designed to keep the problem contained until the assets could be stripped. My routine was simple and terrifying. 3 times a day, a nurse named Betty would come in with a small paper cup containing 2 blue pills and a cup of water. "Mr. Bennett, time for your vitamins," she would say, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. These weren't vitamins. They were chemical restraints, heavy sedatives meant to turn me into the zombie they claimed I already was. I played the part perfectly. I would take the cup, my hand trembling so hard the water sloshed over the rim. I would toss the pills into my mouth and swallow loudly, gulping the water like a man dying of thirst. Then I would open my mouth and lift my tongue, just like they taught her to check. "Good job, Harrison," she would say, patting my shoulder like I was a golden retriever the moment the door clicked shut behind her. I would rush to the bathroom and spit the dissolving blue paste into the toilet, flushing it away before it could seep into my bloodstream. It was a dangerous game. If I swallowed even 1 dose, my mind would fog over, and I would lose the edge I needed to survive. I had to stay sharp. I had to be ready because I knew they were coming. I spent the days sitting by the window watching the parking lot, waiting for the black Audi or the silver Lexus, counting the cars, counting the hours, preparing my mind for the performance that would determine the rest of my life. I couldn't afford a single slip-up if they suspected for even a second that I was lucid, that I was plotting the game would be over, and I would never leave this room again. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the lock on my door beeped. It wasn't the rhythmic code of the nurse, it was the master override. I stayed in the chair, letting my head loll to the side, letting my mouth hang open slightly, staring blankly at the wall. The door swung open, and the scent of Chanel No. 5 filled the room before she even stepped inside. Catherine walked in, looking every inch the concerned matriarch. She was wearing a tailored navy suit, the kind a woman wears to a board meeting or a funeral. She was carrying a thick leather portfolio. Natalie trailed behind her, looking bored, checking her watch as if she had a lunch reservation. She was late for hello. "Harry," Catherine said, her voice soft and patronizing, "how are we feeling today?" I turned my head slowly, blinking, as if the movement took tremendous effort. "Kate." I croaked, my voice rusty from disuse. Is it time to go home yet? She walked over and sat on the edge of the bed, too close, invading my space with her lies. No. Harry, not yet. You are still sick. You need rest, but we need to take care of some things while you get better. She opened the portfolio and pulled out a stack of documents. Thick, heavy paper with little yellow stickies marking the signature lines. What is this? I asked, shrinking back into the chair, feigning fear. It is just some paperwork for the house, Dad, Natalie said, stepping forward, her tone impatient. Mom needs to pay the bills and manage the accounts, but the bank won't let her because your name is on everything. We just need you to sign so we can keep the lights on. I looked at the papers. The words, durable power of attorney, were printed at the top in bold black letters. It was the death warrant of my financial freedom. It gave Catherine total control over every cent I had earned, every property I owned, every decision regarding my life. She could sell the house, liquidate the stocks, and leave me to rot in this room until the money ran out. I do not know, I stammered, my hands fluttering nervously over the paper. I should ask Rebecca, she knows about. Rebecca, the papers. Catherine stiffened at the mention of my lawyer's name, but she recovered quickly, smoothing my hair back with a cold hand. Oh, Harry, you know Rebecca is retired. She moved to Florida years ago, do you not remember? You are confused, sweetie. Just sign the papers so Natalie and I can take care of you. She uncapped a heavy, expensive fountain pen, a pen I had bought for myself 5 years ago, and pressed it into my shaking hand. Sign right here, next to the yellow tag, she directed, pointing a manicured finger at the line. I hesitated, letting the pen hover over the paper, letting the nib tremble and leave small ink blots on the page. I looked up at her, searching her eyes for any trace of the woman I had married 40 years ago. I looked for guilt, for hesitation, for love, but I found nothing, only a hard, glittering greed and the impatience of a predator ready to eat. Okay, Kate, I whispered. If you say so. I lowered the pen and began to write. I made sure my signature was jagged and weak, nothing like the crisp architectural script I had used for decades. I signed my name, Harrison J. Bennett, but I let the letters trail off. I let the lines cross. I made it look like the scrawl of a man whose mind was misfiring, whose motor control was failing. I signed the first page, then the second, then the third. Natalie flipped the pages for me, her eyes locked on the ink, making sure it was legible enough to pass legal muster with every signature. Was handing them the keys to the kingdom, but they didn't know. I was also handing them a grenade with the pin pulled. When I finished the last signature on the final page, Catherine let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She snatched the papers away quickly, blowing on the ink to dry it, before sliding them back into the leather portfolio. The transformation was instant. The concern vanished, replaced by a triumphant smirk. Good boy, Harry, she said, patting my cheek with a little too much force. You did the right thing, now you can just rest. You do not have to worry about anything anymore. We should go, Mom, Natalie said, already moving toward the door. The traffic back to the city is going to be a nightmare. Catherine stood up, smoothing her skirt. She looked down at me one last time, and for a second, the mask dropped completely. She looked at me with pure contempt, looking at the husband she had outsmarted, the obstacle she had finally removed. Rest up, husband dear, she said, and the endearment sounded like a curse. Enjoy your vacation, we will come visit you eventually. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking on the linoleum. Natalie followed without a backward glance, without a goodbye. The heavy door swung shut and the electronic lock engaged with a final decisive beep, sealing me in. I listened to their footsteps fade down the hallway. I listened until the silence of the facility rushed back in, heavy and oppressive. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. I needed them to be clear of the building. Needed them to be in the car, laughing, celebrating, thinking they had won. When 10 minutes had passed, I sat up, the slump in my shoulders, disappearing. The vacant look in my eyes replaced by cold precision, I walked to the bathroom and spat out the residue of the pill I had cheeked earlier. Just in case, then I sat on the bed and pulled off my left shoe. I peeled back the orthopedic insert, my fingers finding the small hollow I had carved into the rubber heel. The Nokia phone was there, nestled like a black pearl. I pulled it out and pressed the power button. The screen lit up a tiny beacon in the gloom. My fingers flew across the keypad, typing the message I had composed in my head 1,000 times over the last 3 days. It was short, it was simple, and it was the end of their world. The fish has bitten, activate clause 19. I pressed send and watched the little envelope icon fly off the screen, carrying my vengeance with it. Clause 19 was the poison pill, the trapdoor Rebecca and I had built into the family trust. 20 years ago, it was a fail-safe designed for exactly this scenario. It stated clearly that in the event the primary grantor was declared incompetent or incapacitated, control of the assets would not transfer to the spouse or next of kin. Instead, the entire estate would immediately freeze and transfer to the control of an independent third-party forensic auditor for a mandatory investigation by using the court order to declare me incompetent and by forcing me to sign that power of attorney. Catherine had just unwittingly triggered a federal audit of her own theft. She thought she had just gained access to millions. But the moment she tried to use that document, the moment she walked into the bank or called the broker, the system would lock her out completely, and worse, the audit would expose the unauthorized transfers, the embezzlement, the sudden liquidation of assets. She hadn't just locked herself out, she had just handed the FBI a signed confession of financial elder abuse. I set the phone down on the bedspread and walked to the window, watching the parking lot far below. I saw the silver Lexus pull out of the visitor space and turn toward the main gate Catherine was driving, and even from here I could tell she was driving fast, eager to get to the bank, eager to start spending. "Go ahead." "Veronica," I whispered to the glass, "go, and try to open the vault. You are in for a hell of a surprise." I wasn't trapped in here with them anymore. They were trapped out there with the consequences of their greed. I turned back to the room and began to gather my things. I put my shoe back on, tying the laces tight. I washed my face in the small sink, scrubbing away the grime and the act of the last 3 days. I was done playing the victim. It was time for the resurrection. I looked at the red fire alarm box on the wall by the door, under a plastic cover that read, "Pull in case of emergency." This was an emergency. My life was on the fire, and I was about to burn the whole corrupt system down. I walked over to the wall, raised my hand, and shattered the plastic cover. The alarm began to scream, a high, piercing wail that signaled the beginning of the end for Catherine Bennett and the return of Harrison Vance. The fire alarm was a deafening shriek that tore through the sterile calm of Sunny Meadows. Flashing strobe lights bathed the hallway in a disorienting pulse of white and red. Just as I predicted, the facility descended into immediate controlled chaos. Nurses were running toward the residential wings, shouting instructions. Over the din, orderlies were rushing past me, their attention fixed on evacuating the bedridden patients in the East Wing. Nobody looked at the old man standing calmly by the window in room 304. I opened the door and stepped out into the corridor. Nurse Betty ran past me, pushing a wheelchair. She didn't even pause, she just yelled, "Stay calm. Mr. Bennett, head toward the fire exit at the end of the hall." She pointed toward the back of the building, toward the secure garden, where they herded the residents during drills. I nodded obediently, but the moment she turned the corner, I pivoted and walked in the opposite direction. I headed straight for the front lobby, moving with a speed and purpose that would have shocked anyone who had seen me shuffling along just an hour ago. The electronic magnetic locks on the main doors automatically disengaged. When the fire alarm tripped, it was a safety code requirement. I knew well from my 40 years in architecture, you cannot trap people inside a burning building, regardless of their mental state. I pushed through the double glass doors and stepped out into the cool afternoon air. The scent of freedom tasted like exhaust fumes and manicured grass. A fire truck was already turning into the long driveway, its siren wailing approaching fast, creating the perfect distraction. I didn't run, running draws attention. I walked briskly toward the service entrance where the delivery vans parked. A yellow taxi was waiting there just past the dumpster enclosure, the engine idling, the back door already unlatched. I slid into the back seat and slammed the door shut. The silence inside the car was sudden and profound, cutting off the screaming alarm. Rebecca was sitting in the front passenger seat, looking back at me with a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. She looked tired, but her eyes were bright with the thrill of the hunt. "Drive," I said to the driver, a man I didn't recognize but who clearly knew the plan. As the taxi pulled away, slipping out the back service road, before the fire marshal could block the exits, I leaned back against the seat and let out a breath I had been holding for 3 days. "Did it work?" I asked, my voice raspy. Rebecca held up her tablet, displaying a secure messaging app linked to my primary banking institutions. "It worked." "Harrison," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. She walked into the First National branch in downtown Chicago 20 minutes ago. "We have a timestamp from the teller's system." I closed my eyes, visualizing the scene. Catherine standing at the marble counter, wearing her best suit, projecting the image of the grieving, burdened wife. She would have slid the power of attorney across the desk, along with the court order declaring me incompetent. She would have asked for a cashier's check, probably for the full balance of the liquid assets, intending to transfer it to the Nevada Trust. "Tell me what happened," I said, needing to hear the mechanics of the trap we had set 22 years ago. Rebecca turned in her seat, facing me fully. She tried to access the Bennett Holdings LLC account. She said she presented the court order granting her emergency conservatorship over Harrison Bennett, the individual. But she forgot one crucial detail: Harrison Bennett. The individual does not own those assets. Harrison Bennett is merely the managing member of the company. I nodded, remembering the day we drafted the operating agreement. Back in 1998, I was younger then, riding the wave of the construction boom. But I was already paranoid. I had seen too many powerful men brought down by divorce, by lawsuits, by greedy children. So I had asked Rebecca to build me a fortress. We called it the Poison Pill Clause. 19 Section 4, a provision buried deep in the corporate bylaws, written in dense legal vernacular that Catherine had never bothered to read because she found business boring. Rebecca continued, her voice taking on the cadence of a law professor, explaining a complex precedent the moment she presented proof of your incapacitation to the bank manager. The system flagged the account specifically because of Clause 19. It states that in the event the managing member is declared mentally incompetent, executive power does not transfer to a spouse or power of attorney. Instead, the company automatically enters a state of administrative lockdown. I knew the rest by heart. The assets weren't just frozen, they were put into a judicial stasis. The bank was legally required to reject her request and immediately notify the Secondary Oversight Committee, which in this case was the firm of independent auditors. "We had designated 2 decades ago. She didn't get a dime," Rebecca said softly. In fact, when the teller tried to override the freeze, the system generated a suspicious activity report automatically sent to the IRS and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, because she attempted to withdraw funds from a frozen corporate entity using a document obtained through what the system now flags as potential fraud. She didn't just walk away empty-handed. Harrison, she walked away with a federal target on her back. I looked out the window, watching the city of Chicago slide past the skyline, looming closer. We were heading back to the neighborhood, back to the scene of the crime. "She is going to be terrified," I said. "She is going to realize the money is gone. She is going to think it is a bureaucratic error." "At first," Rebecca corrected. "She is arrogant, Harrison. She thinks she is smarter than the system. She will call her lawyer. She will scream at the bank manager, but within an hour, she is going to realize that the walls are closing in." She triggered a forensic audit going back 5 years. The auditors will see the transfers to Nevada. They will see the cash withdrawals in Nashville. They will see the jewelry and the cars purchased with company funds. And because she claimed I was incompetent, I added putting the final piece of the puzzle in place. She can't blame me. She can't say I authorized those expenses because she just swore under oath to a judge that I haven't known my own name for months. She trapped herself exactly. Rebecca said she proved her own guilt to establish her control. It is poetic justice of the highest order. The taxi turned off the highway, navigating the familiar streets of my suburb. The trees were just starting to turn color, the leaves crisp and brown falling to the pavement. It looked like a normal autumn afternoon. But for me, it was the end of a lifetime. "Where are we going?" Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer. "Home," I said simply. "Take me to the house, are you sure?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Catherine will be there soon, probably with Natalie. They will be regrouping, trying to figure out why the bank accounts are locked. They will be desperate and desperate. People are dangerous." I said, checking my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked older, tired, the stubble on my face white and rough, but my eyes were clear, so the fog of the last few months, the grief, the confusion. It was all gone. I am not going there to fight them. "Rebecca, I am going there to evict them, and I am the landlord, and their lease has expired." The taxi pulled up to the curb, 3 houses down from my own. I didn't want them to see me arriving. I wanted to walk in and I wanted to cross the threshold on my own 2 feet. "Thank you, Rebecca," I said, opening the door. "You saved my life. You saved yourself, Harrison," she said, squeezing my hand. "I have the police on standby the moment you give the signal. They will move in. The auditors have already sent the preliminary report to the district attorney. The warrants are being typed up as we speak." I stepped out of the car and buttoned my jacket against the wind. I reached into my pocket and felt the weight of the old Nokia phone and the stack of photos I had printed from the surveillance in Nashville. I walked down the sidewalk toward the house I had built. The house where I had raised my daughter, the house where I thought I would grow old in peace. It looked different now. It looked like a stage set where a tragedy had been performed for too long. I could see the lights on inside the dining room. Chandelier was blazing. Catherine and Natalie were home. They were probably celebrating, or perhaps beginning to panic about the bank accounts. Either way, they had no idea that the dead man was walking up the driveway. I reached the front door and reached for my keys, but then I stopped. I didn't need keys. This was my house and I wasn't sneaking in anymore. I checked my watch. It was 7:45 in the evening. The timing was perfect. I smoothed my hair, straightened my collar, and prepared to deliver the performance of my life. I wasn't Harrison the victim. I wasn't Harrison the invalid. I was Harrison Bennett, the architect. And I was about to bring the roof down on their heads. I reached out and grasped the handle, the metal cold and solid under my palm. It was time to go inside and introduce my wife to her husband. I pushed the front door open, and the heavy oak swung inward, with a silence that felt heavy and ominous. The house was warm, filled with the golden light of the chandelier and the smell of expensive catering. It was the smell of victory, or at least what they thought was victory. I could hear voices drifting from the dining room, laughter, and the clink of crystal glasses hitting each other in a celebratory toast. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the Persian runner. I wasn't shuffling anymore. I wasn't the confused old man wandering the streets of Chicago. I was walking with the stride of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. Had stopped at my club on the way over, showered, shaved the gray stubble until my skin was smooth, and changed into the charcoal Armani suit I kept in my locker for board meetings. I looked like the man who had built a firm from nothing. Not the man they had locked in a room. I stopped in the archway of the dining room and just watched them for a moment. It was a tableau of greed, so perfect it almost looked staged. Catherine was at the head of the table, radiant in an emerald green dress, holding a flute of champagne. Natalie sat to her right, flushed and smiling. Looking at a document on the table next to them was a man I didn't recognize. Slick and eager, wearing a realtor's blazer. And there on Catherine's left was Lorenzo. He had flown in from Nashville, just as I predicted. probably eager to secure his share of the loot now that the old man was out of the picture. He was leaning back in my chair, drinking my wine, looking at my wife with a proprietary sneer. To a quick closing, the realtor said. Raising his glass, 2.5 million is a record for this street to freedom, Catherine added, clinking her glass against Lorenzo's. To the package, Natalie giggled. I stepped into the light, adjusting my cuffs with a deliberate, slow movement. Believe the toast is premature, I said. My voice filling the room calm and resonant. The reaction was instantaneous and satisfying. The silence crashed into the room like a physical weight. Catherine turned her head so fast I heard her neck crack. Her eyes widened until they were perfectly round, circles of white terror. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers, hitting the edge of the table and shattering, sending a spray of glass and golden liquid across the tablecloth and onto her expensive dress. Natalie made a sound like a strangled cat. Her mouth falling open, her face draining of all color until she looked like a wax statue. The realtor froze, his smile faltering into a confused grimace, looking from me to them, trying to understand the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. Lorenzo was the only one who moved. He sat up straighter, frowning, looking at me with annoyance rather than fear. Who is this? He asked, looking at Catherine. Why is the gardener in the house? Oh. I walked forward, entering the room, fully allowing the light to catch the sharp lines of my suit and the cold clarity in my eyes. I pulled the chair out from the head of the table, the empty one opposite Catherine, and sat down. I didn't look at Lorenzo. I looked straight at my wife. Hello. Veronica, I said softly. Catherine made a choking sound, her hands clutching the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Harrison, she whispered, her voice trembling. How are you here? I leaned back, crossing my legs, looking at ease in my own home. I walked out the front door. Catherine, it turns out your security measures at Sunny Meadows are more for show than for containment. Much like your marriage vows. Lorenzo stood up, his face darkening. Listen, old man, I do not know who you think you are, but you are trespassing. This represents a private celebration, so I suggest you leave before I call the police. I finally looked at him, allowing my gaze to travel slowly from his slicked back hair down to his Italian loafers resting on my hardwood floor. Then my eyes snapped back up to his face. Sit down, Lorenzo, I said, my voice cracking like a whip. Do not speak to me in my own house, and certainly do not threaten me while you are wearing my property. What are you talking about? He demanded, though he took a half step back, unnerved by my tone. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. I tossed it onto the center of the table, where it landed with a heavy thud right next to the spilled champagne photographs, spilled out, fanning across the white linen. They were high-definition prints taken with a telephoto lens, Catherine and Lorenzo kissing in the driveway in Nashville, Catherine raising a toast to her new fund, Lorenzo driving my wife's car, Catherine laughing on the balcony while talking to our daughter about locking me away. Catherine stared at the photos, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She looked up at me, and the terror in her eyes was absolute. She realized then that I hadn't been in Phoenix. I hadn't been confused, I had been watching. I am the husband, I said, answering Lorenzo's earlier question. I am the man whose money you are spending, the man whose wine you are drinking, and the man whose grandfather's watch you are currently sweating into. Lorenzo looked down at his wrist, instinctively covering the Patek Philippe with his other hand, his bravado evaporating as he realized the gravity of the situation. Natalie started to cry, a high, thin sound of panic. Daddy, please let us explain. We were just doing what was best for you. Stop it, I said, cutting her off without looking at her. Do not call me Daddy, and do not lie to me again. You lost that privilege when you called me a package. Catherine suddenly found her voice. She stood up, slamming her hands on the table, trying to regain control, trying to use the only weapon she had left. Get out, she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. You are incompetent. I have a court order. I have power of attorney. You signed it, Harrison. You signed it. I am your legal guardian, and I am ordering you to leave this house immediately. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that startled the realtor, who was now slowly backing away toward the door. Sit down. Catherine, I said, calm amidst her storm. You are right. I did sign it, and that signature was the worst mistake of your life. What do you mean? She demanded, though her voice wavered. I picked up the bottle of champagne, checking the label. Vintage Dom Perignon bought with my credit card. No doubt, I poured myself a glass, my hand steady as a rock, while they watched in confusion. Do you remember the family trust, Catherine? I asked, taking a sip. Probably not. You never read the bylaws, did you? You found the legal details boring. She stared at me. Mute. 1998. I continued enjoying the dawning horror on her face when I formed Bennett Holdings LLC. I included a safety provision clause, 19. It is called a poison pill. It states that if the managing member, that is me, is ever declared mentally incompetent or incapacitated, executive control does not transfer to the spouse or the next of kin. Catherine sank back into her chair, her legs giving out. Instead, I went on. The entire estate automatically enters administrative lockdown. All assets are frozen. The bank accounts, the investment portfolios, the real estate titles. Everything locks down instantly, and control is transferred to an independent third-party auditor for a mandatory forensic investigation. Natalie put her hands over her mouth, a sob escaping her throat. So when you took that power of attorney to the bank today, I said, looking at Catherine, when you tried to withdraw my money, you didn't unlock the vault. You slammed it shut. You triggered the poison pill. Catherine was shaking her head, denial written across her face. No, the teller said. There was a system error. She said to come back tomorrow. It wasn't an error, I said, leaning forward. It was a federal flag by presenting a document claiming I was incompetent while simultaneously trying to move large sums of money. You triggered a suspicious activity report. The bank didn't just freeze the accounts. Catherine, they called the FBI. The color drained from Lorenzo's face completely. FBI, he whispered, looking at Catherine. You said this was clean. You said he was senile and nobody would look. He is lying, Catherine shrieked, though her eyes betrayed her panic. He is lying to scare us. We have the house we are selling. The house, you cannot sell the house, I said, looking at the realtor who was now clutching his briefcase to his chest. Tell her. Bob, tell her what happens when you try to sell a property that is held by an LLC under audit. The realtor cleared his throat, his voice trembling. Mrs. Bennett, if the title is flagged by a federal audit, we cannot close, we cannot even list it. The title is frozen until the investigation is complete. Investigation, Catherine whispered, the word hanging in the air. Yes, I said, standing up and buttoning my jacket. The forensic accountants are already looking at the books, Catherine. They are looking at the last 5 years of transactions. They will see the transfers to Nevada. They will see the withdrawals in Nashville. They will see the jewelry, the cars, the clothes. And because you swore under oath that I have been incompetent for months, you cannot claim I authorized any of it. You proved your own guilt to establish your control. You walked into a trap, Catherine, and you closed the door behind you yourself. Suddenly, the room was bathed in flashes of red and blue light, filtering through the sheer curtains from the driveway. The sound of sirens cut through the evening air, growing louder and louder. Stopping right outside the front door, Lorenzo jumped up, knocking his chair over. I am leaving. I didn't sign anything. I am not part of this. He scrambled toward the French doors, trying to run to the backyard. Sit down, I roared, and the command was so forceful he froze in his tracks. You are wearing a stolen watch, valued at $80,000. If you run, they will add resisting arrest to the grand larceny charge. Heavy pounding echoed from the front door, followed by a voice booming. Open up, police. Rebecca walked into the dining room. From the hallway she had let them in, she stood beside me looking at Catherine with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "It is over, Catherine," she said quietly. "The district attorney has already issued the warrants based on the bank's fraud report and the evidence Harrison provided." Police officers swarmed into the room, their presence filling the space with authority and the grim reality of consequences. They moved efficiently, cuffing Lorenzo first, who began to weep, begging them to be careful with his suit. Then they moved to Catherine. She didn't fight. She just sat there staring at me, her eyes empty. Her world collapsed. She looked old suddenly. The vibrant woman in the red dress was gone, replaced by a frightened elderly woman who had gambled everything and lost Harrison. She whispered, as the officer pulled her arms behind her back, "Please, do not let them take me. I am your wife." I looked at her, looking at the woman I had shared my life with, looking for any spark of the love I once felt. But there was nothing. Just the cold ash of a burned-down house. "You are not my wife," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Veronica Vance is your name now, and Veronica is going to prison." They led her away past the spilled champagne and the scattered photos, past the life she had destroyed. Natalie sat frozen in her chair, tears streaming down her face, watching her mother being dragged out. "Officer," I said, pointing to Lorenzo, "before you take him, please remove the watch from his left wrist. It is family property." The officer nodded. Removing the Patek Philippe and bagging it as evidence, I watched it go, feeling a strange sense of relief. The watch was safe, the legacy was safe. I looked around the room at the wreckage of the dinner party, at the ruin of my family. The silence returned heavier than before, but it wasn't the silence of a victim. It was the silence of a man who had survived the storm. I turned to Rebecca and nodded. She reached out and squeezed my hand, a gesture of solidarity that meant more than words. I looked at Natalie, who was still sobbing quietly at the table, waiting for her turn, waiting to see if the axe would fall on her too. I walked over to her, standing behind her chair. I looked down at the top of her head, remembering when she was a little girl, remembering the pigtails and the scraped knees. "Daddy," she whimpered, not turning around. "Get up, Natalie," I said, my voice weary but firm. "Get up and go home." She turned to look at me, hope warring with fear in her eyes. You are not sending me with them, not today," I said, looking at the door where her mother had just exited. "But you are out of the will, Natalie. You are out of the trust, and you are out of my life. You chose the money over your father, so you can keep the memory of what you almost had. Now leave." She scrambled up, grabbing her purse, and ran out of the room, fleeing the judgment in my eyes, fleeing the house she had helped turn into a prison. I stood alone in the dining room, the king of a quiet, empty castle. I picked up the glass of champagne I had poured and walked to the window, watching the police cars drive away. Their lights fading into the distance, I took a sip. The wine was cold and crisp. It tasted like victory. It tasted like freedom. I was 70 years old. I was alone, and I had just sent my wife to prison. But as I stood there, I didn't feel old and I didn't feel broken. I felt like an architect standing on a cleared lot, ready to build something new, something strong, something that would last. The demolition was complete. It was time to start the renovation. The police did not wait for an invitation. They swarmed into the dining room with a kinetic energy that shattered the last remnants of the dinner party. The air was suddenly filled with shouting and the heavy thud of boots on hardwood. Lorenzo, seeing the uniforms, panicked. His facade of the suave businessman crumbling instantly into the cowardice of a common thief. He bolted toward the French doors, scrambling over the chair he had knocked down, desperation making him clumsy. "Freeze, police!" one of the officers shouted, tackling him before he could even reach the handle. Lorenzo hit the floor hard, his face pressed against the parquet. The officer wrenching his arms behind his back. "That watch is stolen property," I said, my voice cutting through the noise, pointing at the gold Patek Philippe glinting on his wrist handle. "It with care, it is worth more than he is," Lorenzo whimpered as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked into place. He tried to stammer something about it being a gift, but nobody was listening. Catherine was putting up a fight of a different kind. She wasn't running, she was screaming, a high, shrill sound of pure denial as a female officer spun her around. She thrashed, trying to pull away, her face twisted into a mask of ugly fury that destroyed whatever beauty she had left. "Get your hands off me!" she shrieked, spitting the words at the officer. "I am the victim here. My husband is incompetent. He is dangerous. You are making a mistake. You are under arrest, Mrs. Bennett, for fraud, forgery of medical documents, and elder abuse." The officer recited the Miranda rights with a calm, detached efficiency that only seemed to enrage Catherine more. She turned her wild eyes toward Natalie, who was standing frozen near the sideboard, shaking like a leaf. "Tell them, Natalie," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Tell them he is crazy. Tell them you helped me. Tell them we did it for his own good." Natalie flinched, as if she had been slapped, the color draining from her face as her mother threw her directly into the line of fire to save herself. The betrayal was absolute, and it broke her mom, please. Natalie whispered, tears spilling over her lashes. "Tell them!" Catherine roared as they dragged her toward the door. "Tell them it was your idea to call the doctor." Natalie collapsed, her legs giving out under the weight of the terror and the guilt. She fell to her knees on the floor, her expensive dress pooling around her. She looked small and pathetic, a child caught in a lie that had grown too big to handle. She crawled toward me, her hands reaching out, grasping for the hem of my trousers, looking for the father who had always fixed her mistakes. "Daddy," she sobbed, her voice a broken wail. "Mom made me do it." "She forced me," she said. "You were sick," she said. "We had to protect the money. Please, Daddy, tell them not to take me." I looked down at her, at the daughter I had loved more than my own life. I saw the little girl I had taught to ride a bike. I saw the teenager I had comforted when she didn't get into her first choice college, but then I saw the woman who had sat in the car outside the nursing home and texted while I was locked away. I took a deliberate step back, pulling my leg away from her grasping fingers. She grabbed at empty air, her hands falling to the floor. "No." "Natalie," I said, my voice cold and hard as granite. "Nobody forced you. You are 35 years old. You made a choice. You chose the money over your father. You chose to lock me in a cage so you could secure your inheritance." "Daddy, please," she begged, sniffling loudly. "I am not sending you to prison today," I said, looking at the officer who was waiting for my signal regarding her. "I am not pressing charges against my daughter, but hear me clearly. Natalie, you are dead to me. The bank of Dad is closed forever. You are disinherited, you are out of the trust, and you are on your own. But Dad—" She started to protest. "Live with your choice, Natalie," I said, turning my back on her. "Live with the memory of what you did for a few dollars. Now get out of my house before I change my mind." She scrambled up, sobbing hysterically, grabbing her purse and running out the front door, fleeing the judgment. In my eyes, fleeing the wreckage of the family she had helped destroy. The police hauled Catherine and Lorenzo out into the night. The flashing red and blue lights painting the walls of the dining room in a chaotic strobe. I stood alone in the center of the room, listening to the sirens fade into the distance, until the only sound left was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and my own steady breathing. It was over 1 month later. The house was quiet, the way I liked it. The forensic audit was complete. The accounts were unlocked, and the money, including the $32 million in shares, was secure under the new trust. I sat in my favorite leather armchair facing the large window that looked out over Lake Michigan. The afternoon sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the room. I held a glass of the vintage wine in my hand, swirling the dark liquid. Gently, I took a sip and savoring the taste of victory and peace. The house was empty of lies, empty of betrayal. It was just me and the truth. They looked at me and they saw an old man, I said softly to the empty room. My voice calm and reflective. They saw gray hair and wrinkles and they assumed I was weak. They assumed I was prey, and I looked at my reflection in the glass of the window. The image of a man who had survived the fire. They forgot that the old have something that youth never has, I continued. They forgot about experience. They forgot that you do not get to be 70 years old in this world without learning how to hunt. They forgot that the old wolf is the most dangerous one in the pack because he knows exactly when to bite. I leaned back, closing my eyes, feeling the profound relief of absolute freedom. I had lost a wife who was a stranger and a daughter who was a traitor. But I had regained the most important thing of all. I lost a fake family, I whispered, raising my glass in a solitary toast. But I found my freedom, and that price was absolutely worth it. We often believe that time guarantees loyalty, but I learned the hard way that the sharpest knives are held by those we hug. My family looked at my gray hair and saw a victim. They forgot that a lifetime of experience makes you a hunter, not prey. True strength isn't about never falling. It's about having the courage to burn down a fake life to save your dignity. Never let anyone convince you that you are past your prime or powerless. You are the architect of your own life, and it is never too late to redesign your future. If Harrison's story of justice satisfied you, please hit the like button and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Have you ever discovered a secret that changed everything? I want to hear your story in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going. Thanks, Famos, for watching.